You put on a jacket without thinking about it. Cold morning, you grab a coat. Rain outside, you grab a hood. It feels obvious. It feels like the only reason clothes exist. But that's not why your ancestors started wearing them. For most of human history, you didn't need clothes to survive the weather. Your body was already built for it. Hair once covered you the way it covers a chimpanzee today. And underneath that hair, your skin knew how to handle heat, cold, sun, and rain. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Your ancestors lost most of their body hair. Their skin was exposed. And still, for a long stretch of time afterward, they didn't cover it up. So when did that stop? When did bare skin become something humans decided to wrap, drape, and eventually sew shut? And more importantly, why? Not for the reason you'd guess. Not first because of the cold. Something else happened first, and the cold came later, almost as an afterthought. Let's start with the evidence, because this isn't a guess. It's written into your genes. In 2003, biologist Mark Stoneking and his colleague Ralf Kittler studied something strange. Human body lice, not head lice. Body lice, the kind that live in clothing, not hair. Body lice can only survive by clinging to fabric. No fabric, no lice. So Stoneking and Kittler compared the DNA of body lice to head lice, measuring how long ago the two split into separate species. The answer came back at roughly 170,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Body lice couldn't exist before there was something for them to live in. No fabric folds, no seams, no layer of cloth against skin, no habitat. Which means somewhere around 170,000 years ago, humans started wearing something regularly enough and consistently enough that an entirely new species of parasite had time to evolve and specialize around it. That number matters more than it first appears. 170,000 years ago sits well within a warm interglacial period in Africa, not the depths of an ice age, not a sudden freeze. Your ancestors, at that point, were living somewhere hot. That's long before the last ice age reached its coldest point, long before humans pushed into Europe's freezing winters. The timing doesn't line up with a sudden cold snap. It lines up with something else entirely, and that's the part almost nobody expects. Archaeologist Gilligan has spent years studying this exact question, and his research points somewhere unexpected. Gilligan has spent decades cross-referencing climate data with the archaeological record of clothing-related tools. Scrapers used to soften hide, awls used to pierce it, needles used to join it. What he found is that the earliest known clothing-related tools in Africa show up not during the coldest stretches, but well before them. Gilligan's conclusion is that clothing in Africa likely didn't start as protection from cold at all. It started as protection from the sun, from thorns, from biting insects, and, just as importantly, as a form of display. A way to signal identity, status, and belonging. Something worn on purpose, not something grabbed out of desperate necessity. Here's the plain English version of what that means. A tool that softens hide doesn't tell you why the hide was worn, but the timing tells you plenty. Early humans didn't invent clothing because they were freezing. They invented it because it was useful in the heat of Africa, and it very quickly became something else too. Meaningful. A layer of identity worn on the body, centuries before it ever needed to be a layer of insulation. So let's reconstruct what this actually looked like. Picture an early human roughly 150,000 years ago, somewhere in eastern Africa. The sun is high. The ground is dry and cracked. This person drapes a piece of animal hide loosely over one shoulder. Not because the temperature demands it, but because it protects raw skin from thorny brush during a hunt, and because the particular way it's tied says something to everyone else in the group. Which family? Which role? Maybe even which achievements? A hide worn a certain way might mark a successful hunter. A strip of ochre-stained leather might mark someone tied to a specific kin group. None of this is written down anywhere. There's no language for it that survives. But the body itself becomes the message. For tens of thousands of years, this is roughly what clothing means. Loose, draped, occasional. A tool for sun and thorns and status, not a daily requirement for survival. Now shift the scene forward, tens of thousands of years, and move it north. Follow small groups of humans as they push out of Africa, along coastlines, across the edges of Asia, eventually into the teeth of Ice Age, Europe, and Siberia. Winters there were brutal. Temperatures that could kill an exposed human within hours, no matter how much lean muscle or fat reserve they carried. Loose draped hide wasn't going to be enough anymore. Something had to change, and it did. This is where the second evidence stack comes in, and it comes from bones and needles, not lice. At the site of Sungir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found human burials covered in thousands of tiny ivory beads, some burials containing over 3,000 of them each. The beads weren't scattered randomly. Their positions on the skeletons trace the outline of fitted garments, sleeves running down the arms, leggings running down the legs, something resembling a cap around the skull. Not draped fabric loosely thrown over a shoulder. Tailored fabric, cut and shaped to the body. And in Denisova Cave in Siberia, researchers have recovered eyed needles dating back over 40,000 years. Small, fine, deliberately shaped tools with a hole punched through one end for thread. A needle like that isn't for draping a hide over your shoulders. It's for closing a seam, for joining two pieces of fur into a sleeve, for making something airtight enough to trap warmth against skin in temperatures that could otherwise kill you by morning. This is a critical shift, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Draped clothing keeps the sun off and thorns out. Fitted, sewn clothing does something completely different. It traps a layer of warm air against the body, the same principle behind a modern down jacket. That's not a small improvement. That's an entirely different technology, built on top of a much older one. Some researchers have connected this shift in tailoring ability to a much bigger question: why Homo sapiens were able to push deep into frozen Eurasia and thrive there, while Neanderthals, despite living in cold Europe for far longer, for hundreds of thousands of years, show far less evidence of tailored, sewn clothing in their archaeological record, fewer eyed needles, fewer traces of fitted garments. It's one thread among several explaining why one species expanded across a frozen continent while the other eventually disappeared from it. So clothing didn't start as a response to cold. It became a solution to cold after it already existed for entirely different reasons. Protection from sun and thorns, identity, belonging. Function came first in the African heat. Warmth came later, thousands of generations afterward, once humans needed it in the frozen north. And meaning ran through the entire timeline, start to finish. Here's the counterintuitive twist. You'd assume the coldest environments produced the most clothing, but some of the most elaborate prehistoric clothing evidence. The thousands of ivory beads at Sungir, the fine tailored seams, the symbolic patterns pressed into fur and leather, isn't just about surviving the cold. It's about status in the cold, who could access rare, warm furs from difficult-to-hunt animals, who had the skill or the connections to have a perfect seam sewn for them. In the harshest environments humans ever settled, clothing became one of the first technologies that let people broadcast who they were, not just where they were or how cold it happened to be that day. Now bring it back to you. Every time you choose an outfit, you're doing something your ancestors were already doing 170,000 years ago, long before there was a word for fashion. You're not just regulating your temperature, you're saying something. A specific brand, a particular color, a cut that signals which group you belong to, what you value, how much effort you want people to think you spent, how you want to be seen walking into a room. The lice in that ancient genetic study didn't care about any of that. They just needed fabric to live in. But the humans wearing the clothing clearly cared, because that impulse, display, identity, belonging, was baked in from the very beginning, long before warmth ever entered the picture. You didn't start wearing clothes because you were cold. You started wearing clothes because you wanted to be seen.